Hi, it's John. Thanks again for joining us here at FinTech Plus. I'm very pleased to be joined today by another great fintech company from abroad. It's Charlie Delingpole, and he is the CEO of ComplyAdvantage. Hi, Charlie. How are you doing?
Hey, John. It's great to be here on FinTech Plus.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I have to say thanks to Tim on your team, who was great to reach out to us and tell us the story of your company. And I'm thrilled to share it with our audience today. I've mentioned you're the CEO. I haven't said much more, and I like to hand it over at this point and give you the opportunity to do the talking. So if you wouldn't mind.
Great. Yeah. So ComplyAdvantage, we help companies with their anti-money laundering and terrorist financing obligations. So many companies struggle when they're onboarding and monitoring their clients. They have to comply with legislation around sanctions, political exposure, adverse media. And so we have the most advanced system to help companies determine if their clients are terrorists, money launderers, or criminals, and therefore adhere to their international obligations. We have kind of roughly 1,000 clients all over the world, and offices now in London, New York, Singapore, and elsewhere.
I'm excited to get into that in just a couple of moments. But before we do, I like to bring some context to this. Can you tell us a bit about your journey to becoming an entrepreneur and founding the company?
Great. Yeah. So personally, this is my third company. I started the first one when I was 16. I guess the second company I started was a fintech company before fintech was fintech. And part of the challenge there was having to onboard companies and then lend money to them within 24 hours without knowing who they were in reality and determining if they were a threat. And the bit of the challenge there that I hated was that in the back of your mind, you were this money laundering reporting officer role, and therefore if something went wrong with that front, then you would go to jail. So startup companies and fintechs always focus on growth and revenue, but yet often their biggest team and their biggest overhead is compliance and AML. So with this company, really, I saw that the way in which it was done was deeply broken and structurally flawed. And so we wanted to come up with a new way here to solve those problems. And so what we've done is use algorithms to solve that. And that was the kind of genesis and journey to ComplyAdvantage.
Very cool. You actually got to cover a few more topics than I was expecting there, which is always helpful. Thanks. Can you tell us a little bit about how the company came together? I understand algorithms are a key part of it, but what exactly was the business model that took shape and I guess the technology stack that came together to deliver that to your clients?
Before I started the company, the way in which it was done was you'd have companies like WorldCheck, Reuters, Dow Jones, LexisNexis, and what they have is teams of 600 researchers who manually compile databases of people and companies. What we've done is, rather than using researchers, is we have the best part of, say, 150, 200 engineers and machine learning developers. So what we'll do is we'll look at different data sets. So we'll say unstructured, semi-structured, structured data, and then we'll look at the sanctions data, political exposure, adverse media. And also what we have now is a database of every company in the entire world and every director and every shareholder in those companies. And what we've done is build this vast web and network of facts and linkages and structures around people and companies. So we can kind of use things like semantic reasoning to determine connections and facts. And we're just constantly ingesting more and more data in multiple languages. We're looking at more labels for each person and each company. We have a kind of 15 category taxonomy now. If that person's involved in cybercrime, in human trafficking, we can look at the nature of the business and say, is that business actually a media company or is it a pornography studio? So none of that's possible if we're doing things manually. So I think what we're evolving towards is kind of this hyperscale data that goes beyond what is possible with humans, and just kind of is a whole new world view on how you can solve risk.
Very, very interesting. It's an entire paradigm shift, a radical shift that you're talking about. Is that something that companies are really taking too easily, or do you find that that is requiring some education and thought leadership as well with your company?
So I was onboarded for a trust like last week, and that was in the Channel Islands. And as part of that, I was like, hey, what are you using to tell them that I'm not a terrorist? And they were like, we're using WorldCheck because that's what we've always used, and that's what the regulator in Jersey uses, right? So that kind of mentality is kind of like deeply flawed in the sense that it's simply because it worked in the past, we're going to carry on doing it in the future, and because someone else uses it, we'll use it too. So we're entering a kind of social structure that exists prior to this period, but is deeply flawed. And because of that, you have huge fines, you have people in jail, you have money laundering, terrorist financing. So I think the reason to start the company was because these systems don't work, and because there is a far better way. So I think any new company, you have to overcome the existing structures and processes and communicate to them why what you're doing is better for them and for society and the economy.
That's a very deep point that you're getting to there, and I think probably complex in terms of sometimes how people can be labeled and marginalized by some of these things, and that's a whole other ball of wax. I know Nelson Mandela was on some watch lists for a while and had to be cleared off, but anyway, I digress. When it comes to comparing yourself to, say, traditional solutions like the ones you've mentioned, when you're looking at this like a customer, say a compliance officer at a bank or another institution that's comparing your service to others, is the offer that you're actually making to them quite similar? Is it something like a subscription or access to a tool? How does that work?
We're the first company which has both the companies, as in every company in the world, and all the risk data, which is seamlessly integrated into a single database. So that's different. Secondly, the data's better, right? So the problem with the incumbents is that their data's out of date, right? So you need like real-time data, right? It has to be constantly refreshed. Secondly, you need it to be much broader in terms of it has to encompass every fact possible, whereas the one they have doesn't. So I think it's very different in a number of ways. And as we get bigger and as we invest more, it will evolve and become even more different. So I think the kind of the acceleration that we have and is possible versus their kind of stagnation means that I think ultimately our victory is assured.
That's very interesting to see. I'm curious to watch it develop. I'm curious, speaking of development, you're a seasoned entrepreneur, Charlie. You've grown companies before, and I'm sure you know that people are interested to hear about the traction. I was impressed to hear of the scale already of ComplyAdvantage. Can you speak for a moment about some of the business milestones, organizational milestones, and especially financing milestones as you've grown the company?
Specifically, we raised a seed round in 2016, and then same year we raised a convertible round, and then we raised in 2016, late 2016, we raised the Series A from Boulderton Capital, which was a $7 million round. The Series B was from Index Ventures, and that was $30 million, and that was 2 years later in 2018. And then we raised our Series C 2 years later in July of last year, which was $50 million. So it's basically been every 2 years we've done a new round.
Congratulations. That sounds like the indication is that growth is going very well. When it comes down to where you're actually focused right now, is it on further developing the product, building your team, expanding your client reach? Can you talk for a minute, about where the focus really is at the moment?
I think any company, at least for me, is fundamentally building and selling and then triangulation around that. And therefore, everything is geared towards how can we help our customers better. And therefore, I think we had a record Q4, record Q1 this quarter now in terms of sales. We've got some big product announcements coming through in the next few weeks. Lots of changes in terms of different features being upgraded, different data sets being added. So I think everything is subordinated towards building and selling. And I think this business requires terrifying scale in terms of, I think ultimately a single data set will be used globally rather than having multiple data sets. So I think the rationale behind the financing was scale in of its own right. So I think that financing is plowed into people who build and help clients use it.
Thank you. I was curious, when we look to the future, where do you see the company going? Can you talk about your grand vision and in particular about some of the more concrete plans for the next coming years?
So the kind of vision since day one has been the constant expansion of the breadth, depth, sophistication, scale, speed, intelligence of the core data set and system. And if you look at the number of profiles and the number of searches against the database, that's risen very, very quickly. So the two numbers that we have are numbers of facts, numbers of profiles, and then the searches against the database. So yeah, I think everything is about increasing that velocity and size and scale, and getting the whole world to use what we have.
Could you talk for a moment about specific markets you're interested in developing? We're really focused on international growth here, and we look at FinTech as being the core of a lot of convergence around the digital economy. And that means, a lot of the companies we talk with are working in a number of different industries. And given the importance of financial crime and its connection to the whole economy, I can imagine you have quite an interesting story when it comes to market growth.
So in terms of which markets we're looking at, there's geographic and industry verticals, and we're applicable to every one of them. So that means that we're in 80 plus countries. We're in lots of big enterprise banks. We're in insurance companies, in fintechs, in lending. Wherever there's money being moved or a client being onboarded, or a client being monitored as a client, then we're very, very relevant to that. So in terms of focus, I guess a lot of our clients didn't exist 5 years ago. So what we have is very flexible and very easily deployable for startup companies. But then also, I think fundamentally we were architected for the biggest banks and the biggest problems that exist out there. So I think we're making good progress in terms of converting some of the most heavily regulated institutions as well over to our platform.
That sounds like a task that is not to be underestimated, but good to hear the progress that's being made. What do you think are the pressures that are out there in the world on a high level that are really helping your business, but then also creating challenges as you scale up and see this spread?
There are many structural forces that you can point to which are tailwinds for what we're doing. I think firstly is public opinion is less tolerant of evil, bad stuff happening, right? I think most recently the kind of furore around people like Jeffrey Epstein or ISIS or different corruption scandals. I think things like sex trafficking and human trafficking and terrorism are not going to become more popular in the future. They're only going to become more pressurized as trends. I think so there's that. And then there's secondly, the underlying competition between incumbent banks and fintechs in terms of the barriers to entry have fallen drastically. And therefore, most companies have to remain very, very competitive. And therefore, if one of their biggest costs is compliance and AML, they need to find a better way of doing that, both in terms of the costs they have, but also in terms of potential fines and also the speed of client onboarding. So structurally, those two trends coalesce in ComplyAdvantage and helping companies be more efficient, but also more effective in terms of the way they manage their financial crime risks.
I want to take a bit of a different turn and step back to ask you another question about the team. And you work in a very data intensive, your team's probably filled with a lot of data analysts. And I was speaking to a gentleman from Google, Andrew Smart, who's involved in their AI ethics business. And one of the challenges he's looking at is how do we build these systems and manage them in an ethical fashion? And it's interesting, they actually use RegTech like ComplyAdvantage to help solve those types of problems. But one of the criticisms that's often talked about in Silicon Valley is diversity in teams of various different sorts. And I like to ask a lot of different entrepreneurs, especially those who've had a lot of experience and have large teams, what are some of the ways that you look at building your organization, the profiles of people, and how you keep it well-rounded within your company, whether it's diversity or different skill sets. People think of this in different ways, I think.
Yeah, I think the AI ethics dimension is very interesting in terms of the way you can look at that. I guess that wasn't necessarily the question you asked, but yeah, I think to answer it, I guess what we're doing is fundamentally very positive for society and very moral in terms of what we're doing is helping prevent all kinds of evil things happening. So we're not like Google selling adverts, right? And we're not kind of publishing data which is like misleading in the same way that Google might do. So I think there we come off with flying colors. In terms of how do we promote diversity within the company, I guess as a global company, we have people from a huge range of backgrounds, and therefore what we try to do is, I think currently there are various initiatives in terms of analyses of the different genders, ethnicities, and sexual orientations within the company, and how we can make people more welcome within those groups. I think as a company, we try to do all we can to promote that and encourage a broad range of applicants and the success of the company.
That's great. One of the other areas that we find always interesting is sort of neurodiversity and different skill sets, whether it's more analytical minds, the Elon Musks of the world out there who can solve engineering challenges and complex AI challenges, or let's say the more soft-spoken social types and how they fit into organizations in different ways. And what we hear all the time at fintech companies is they've got this really interesting mix of folks who are building these advanced technologies, whether it's crypto or AI or cybersecurity, with the people who are actually normalizing it and selling it and making it a part of our lives. So I was curious if that's something your company experiences as well. And it sounds like, obviously, with the diversity and the scale of it, you've got a full range of people helping to make it a great business. I wanted to ask you just quickly on the ethics topic. I was speaking yesterday with Anna Artushina, and she's an expert on data trusts. We were talking a lot about new solutions from fintech that are controlling the way people's information are shared with data platforms and aggregators like Google or Facebook. And I would imagine, given the nature of your business, tracking things like board members and personal relationships, that you, number one, look at the topic of where can you access data, but also must have some sort of perspective on the ethics around data management and privacy. I was wondering if you could say a few words there.
Yeah, I think if you're doing data harvesting for the purposes of selling adverts, then that's very different to if you're indexing the details around a terrorist attack and you're trying to trace them explicitly for the prevention and detection of crime. So everything we do is around the prevention and detection of crime, and therefore the ethics are very kind of clear cut. In terms of data, companies are legally obliged to do this. So there really isn't any question around how marginal or arguable, as in it's a legal obligation. So I think most tech companies would struggle because what they're doing is around harvesting personal data without people's consent in order to sell them things, which is not what we're doing.
I don't know if this would be a controversial topic for you, but sitting in Switzerland, I sometimes get myself into trouble by mentioning there's been a bit of a track record for scandals and things that have a little bit too much to do with the past of secrecy in Switzerland that I don't think evolved quickly enough into being a more nuanced idea of privacy or data protection, which is very rapidly happening now. And I think you can probably also see that Switzerland's a leader in many ways in how these topics are being evolved. But when we talk specifically about finance and the topic of financial crime, obviously Switzerland has played an important role in various different ways in solving the problem, but also unfortunately being a victim of being a jurisdiction that's been associated with a lot of financial crime. When it comes to Switzerland, are there any use cases or particular opportunities you see coming from the perspective of what you do with ComplyAdvantage, where you see financial crime could be better addressed and solved from here within Switzerland?
Yeah, I think the obvious crime that comes to mind is tax evasion and people putting all their money in Switzerland to avoid tax. They think it's like anonymous. And I think what you've seen with the Panama Papers and other kind of offshore entities is those being leaked and people going to jail for avoiding tax. So I think that's obviously a great thing. If there are kind of terrorists or money launderers or people who are involved in corruption or bribery who are using Switzerland as a center to have their finances processed, then also should the institution be willing, but obviously very keen to help them determine if they aren't fully conscious already who is bad within their client base.
I won't pick on Switzerland too much. I think they've been doing a great job of trying to lead the way with whether it's crypto finance or anti-money laundering. And I look forward to seeing more of ComplyAdvantage around town. I wanted to ask you, are there some other sort of big topics in terms of what's been going on, especially in this last year with all the change that COVID has ushered in, that really you find interesting or you think really illustrate where ComplyAdvantage is helping to solve these real world problems?
So in terms of where there's been change, we published the State of Anti-Money Laundering 2021 on our website, which is a kind of a free 60-page report you can go and download if you Google that. And there's obviously a ton of content there in terms of some of the huge changes that have been happening in the US with the Anti-Money Laundering Act, in the EU with the 6th AML directive, elsewhere in terms of the geopolitical ramifications of China versus the US and the swing to more sino-skepticism within most of the US political classes. So I think tons of different interesting things happening. And thankfully, ComplyAdvantage can help with all those, because whatever the risk is, whether it's human trafficking, money laundering, terrorism, we have the key facts that you need in our database.
That was a great tee up for my last point. I wanted to mention that we're not going to, we'll skip the demo that we sometimes do here with our guests, because I think we've got a few sensitive things here and it should be kind of obvious how such a tool works. But I wanted to mention we will link to the demo that you guys provide on your website. And what's most important here, I think, is that companies that are interested get in touch with you guys and your team to really understand the unique nature of their financial crime risk and your very sophisticated solution for that. I wonder though, Charlie, are there any final messages you want to leave with the audience for FinTech Plus? Because again, I think you've done a great job of telling a rather complicated story here today, and I don't want to overwhelm them.
Yeah, I think we covered lots of the kind of fin side. I guess in terms of the tech side, a big trend is towards APIs and microservices and where you can, focusing on where you add the most value. And I guess a big focus for us, which we haven't really covered, is building the best APIs and having it being deployable instantly, having lots of configurability. So yeah, I think if anyone's interested in APIs and great, scalable, robust technology, then we'd love to chat as well.
Excellent. Well, it's always nice to leave people with a surprise and a nice bonus. So thank you for treating our audience to that today. Charlie, this has been fun and really informative. I have to say I'm impressed and looking forward to seeing more from ComplyAdvantage in the coming months. I hope we can keep in touch. Again, we'll keep the information on how to get in touch with you available for anybody. And I'm sure you're a friendly guy to others as well. So thank you for the time today.
Awesome to meet you, John.
It's been a pleasure. All the best.